Hey everybody, check out these planes. There's like some leaves going on and some other detail, and it's the same thing, right? That looks the same, but it isn't. This is a crumpled plane with a leaf normal map on it, and this is a flat plane that has had a leaf normal map and the crumpled plane normal map combined together to achieve the same result. And this magic has been achieved with these node groups, surface gradient math, which is the topic of this video. More accurately, this video is about how we combine multiple sets of normals. We've built this whole crazy setup in our previous videos that lets us transfer normals accurately onto the face, wrap things to it, do all sorts of stuff. So we get normals coming from multiple places. Maybe we're bringing in like a nose or some brow ridge or a cheek or whatever, but then what do we actually do with all those? The answer overall is that it depends on what these different shapes and normals are and how precise they need to be. Do they overlap? Does it matter if they don't quite have the curvature of the surface under them? Like, can you just stick them on, or do you need to wrap them around? And there's different math for different circumstances. Most of the time, we can get the best, most high-quality results using the same sort of math as is used in tangent space normal mapping. But that's also the most complicated and the most work to set up. That will be the subject of the next video. In this video, we'll build up to it by going through surface gradients, which are a bit simpler, but also more limited. So we'll understand what they can do and what they can't. Like, here's an example. Here's a forehead and cheek decals that have been wrapped around our face mask. And thanks to surface gradients, we can conveniently transfer their normals over to the face and combine them with the already transferred normals of the face mask. So like, here's a bit of a brow ridge. And this is a mix factor, but that's the same as like, this is a displace shaping it. And we've got a similar thing going on over here on the cheek, but it's pretty rough. Anyway, more about this setup later. Now, a slight disclaimer I'm going to give is that a lot of this math stuff is really complicated, and I don't fully understand all of it. I understand how we can use what we've got, but I don't know if there's some other solution to one of the problems we're going to identify here that I don't know about. So keep that in mind and check the description of the video, because hopefully someone is going to come in and tell me something I didn't know that will solve some of the problems, and if they do, I'll put it in the description. So I guess that's the intro, which I recorded last as usual, and this is the part where I remind you that you can support me on Patreon if you really like me. And now we get into the rest of the video. Our most straightforward option for mixing two sets of normals is, well, mix. What we've got here is a plane, a copy of that plane that has been bent with simple deform, so they have the same indices, and we have a pyramid. And we have our typical normal transfer setup. So here is the normals of the bent plane, and that's the same thing. That's an index transfer. And we also have the normals of the pyramid. And this looks a bit weird because, you know, the pyramid's only about that big, but everything outside of that is getting the nearest because it isn't an index transfer. And if I plug these into a mix node, it's easy to toggle back and forth. But this isn't really a combination of the two yet. So to use this pyramid properly, we're going to need a proximity mask. So we'll do that. And let's plug this in here, and I'll change it in the material so we can view the mask. We need to get that working correctly. So it's working off faces right now, and it's not filling in the middle, because since this has a shape, it's not detecting this stuff. So if we really want it to work properly, we're going to want to flatten it. And to do that, we'll grab these nodes. In this case, it's flattening it on Y. If this is a more complicated setup, we might need to flatten it on a transferred normal or something, but this will work fine for this example. And now we need to turn that mask into the proper range. We want it to be black where the pyramid is. Let's make that a greater than, but a very low value in there. Greater than 0 doesn't quite work. You want to go for something small. So we don't want any bleed from that. And now we can plug that in there. And we have our pyramid where the pyramid is, and we have the curved surface everywhere else. And we've got some artifacts, some weirdness going on with the middle of the pyramid, which is probably due to split edges, but we're not going to worry about that in this example. I've got a very high subsurf level on this plane so that we're capturing the pyramid decently. Without it, well, now it's messing up the index transfer. So we won't worry about that. So anyway, this is successfully combining these two different sets of normals, in that we have one in one area and one in another. But what if we wanted this pyramid to be curving around the plane to match its curvature? Like right now, what we've basically got is the pyramid like here, or, here, I guess. What if we wanted it to also bend around? One option, of course, is to throw the same sort of simple deform bend onto the pyramid or bind this to the surface, which is a good option if this pyramid had the right sort of topology to bend, but it doesn't. And I guess I can subdivide it, and then we start introducing topology problems and all sorts of issues like that. So that is a potential option, but it's kind of a case-by-case basis. You have to model for that, and we'll talk more about that in a minute. But the issue that we really want to introduce is, what if instead of just a pyramid, we were trying to combine something much more complex? Like, here is a copy of the plane where I've just randomized the surface to crumple it. So this is a case where this whole thing, it's the same size. So if we mask between this and this, then we're not really accomplishing anything. Like, here's the nodes for that. We'll plug that in instead. And, one is the plane curved and one is it crumpled. So what if we want our final shape to be a combination of the two, not merely a switch between the two? So the puzzle is combining two different surfaces into a third surface. And there's a lot of different ways that can be done. And some can only be done on the mesh level, and some can be done in the shader as well. Basically, anything that can be done in the shader can also be done on the mesh level, because it's the same math, just on a pixel level instead of a vertex or face level. But things that can be done in the mesh level cannot necessarily be done in the shader, because the graphics card only works on parallel processing single elements. So our two options are basically combining the normals mathematically in some way in order to get a third different normal, or combining the positions in some way in order to get a different normal. And we're going to look at some examples of both. Okay, so I've made a new collection so that we have the previous example when I put the file out. And I've added this plane, which is where we'll actually be working. And this one over here is just copying its normals so that we can see what's happening. So we've got the positions of both of these, and we're going to combine them with math somehow and get something. That's something we've got there. When you add them, of course, it's going to expand it. And if I subtract them, we're going to get pretty much 0. And multiplying them, there's all sorts of things we can do here. And part of the problem we've got is kind of almost a philosophical question, which is, what is the correct combination of these two shapes? What does it mean to combine these? And we're going to come back to that problem. But we're going to try a couple of obvious things we can do. So one is, we start with setting it to the bent plane's locations, and then we're going to add just the y offset of the crumpled plane. So that has basically given us a bent and crumpled shape, but it's only added the crumple in this direction facing the y-axis. So we have basically the full amount of crumple here, but less of it at the sides. So that works, but it isn't generally what we would think of. I think what we really want is to wrap this around this plane, which is what we're going to get to. So what does it look like if we just take that crumpled plane and we bend it with simple deform? Well, it looks like that, which is pretty similar, except at the edges. In the middle, we're getting about the same thing, but as we get towards the edges of it, it's different. And that's because this has more of the bumps off the edges. So can we get a node set up that gives us this, basically? Well, other than just recreating simple deform, for an operation as simple like that, that would probably be the easiest thing to do. But this is just an example of things that will be much more complicated if we're working with, different features of a character's face. So we do want to be able to achieve this sort of same result, but based on combining two shapes. So I've made another copy, and I should point out before I forget that on this setup, this addition, this would be the same as just doing the offset. The offset is that. But anyway, let's get a displace. This time what we'll do is get the difference on Y of the crumpled plane, and note that our crumpled plane is only crumpled on the Y-axis. I did that on purpose because otherwise we'd have to do more and these examples would get even more complicated. But yeah, we'll get that difference and we'll get ourselves a displacement. And right now it's displacing by the full amount. Let's displace by just that amount. And voila, we have the same thing as the simple deform bent version. You can see from the colors that it is the same. So what operation have we actually done here? We've taken the amount that the crumpled plane is different in a flat direction, and we've applied that in the direction of the normals. That's what displacement is. That's why you only displace by a float, a single thing. It's how much to displace on the normals. And this is working cleanly because we just had a bent shape. So basically this works great for this example, but it may not work in all situations and for all shapes. And as I said, if we had the crumpled plane be different in more directions than just Y, then we would also have to do movement on the normals X and, well, its other axes, and that gets more complicated, although it is possible. So combining two shapes by literally combining their positions is great when you can do that. And that can be done in geometry nodes. We cannot do it in the shader nodes, in Eevee at least, because that doesn't have a vertex shader. You can move vertices around with displacement in cycles and malt, and Eevee will probably get it soon. So we may be able to do that in the future. But it's still a kind of cumbersome way to do things, and it doesn't always work. And we don't always have the literal meshes to transform. Sometimes you just have a normal map, either object space or a tangent map or something like that. So we also want to be able to combine shapes into a single shape, just working with the normals. So let's look at that next. So here's a new plane that we'll be comparing, and we are going to use it to learn finally about surface gradients, which I showed back in the very distant past in the first video in this series. So surface gradients are a way that we can combine multiple layers of normals and add them together properly. So surface gradients are something I learned about when I was first trying to understand bump mapping. And as you can see in my group, the reference is to this big paper, which is about bump mapping and combining different sources of surface normals. Like if you, say, had a bump map and a normal map, and you wanted to combine that with an object space map. And it's a lot of math and it's complicated, and I think I understand it all at this point, because I've been trying to understand it for, 8 or 9 months now. But there's still things that I'm not sure I really understand. So I'm going to say that up front, that I understand how to use these tools. I don't fully have a mental model of exactly what this math is doing so well that I can pass it on. So we're not going to talk too much about what each step of this is doing. We're just going to talk how you can use it and what results it gives you, because I do know that it works when used with the type of setup we're trying to build. And maybe somebody out there with a lot more math knowledge can point us in the right direction. But of course, I'll put a link to this paper in the description, and you are welcome to go read it yourself. So without getting into a lot of complex math, what is this for? Essentially, you can think of surface gradients as a difference between two normals. So we get the surface gradient of these two, and if I let it just be the attribute here, that's the surface gradient. It looks kind of like the normal did before this one, but it's like flipped or something. So we're still looking at a color vector representing rotation. And what we do with this now is, if we combine this back with the original surface normal, then we're back to where we started. So we'll mix that with that, and we're looking at the same thing here. And the same thing goes if we were to use our crumpled plane instead. And here's where it gets really interesting. So we'll get the surface gradient between the original plane and both of them, and not that anymore. We can add those together before we resolve it. And does that look familiar? Yep. It's very slightly different at the edges, but basically this is giving us the same result as this, where we were adding the positions, but just the difference from y. So that's how you can think of what a surface gradient is. It's the equivalent of stacking up just the differences on y when you have like a something that has been flattened but has surface detail, except it's all rotation math. We haven't moved a single vertex. So you can do this exact same math in the shader nodes. Here's the shader, same groups. It's exactly the same. But it's not the same as this, where we mapped this around the surface of this. If what we had was a version of, if we had this and we had a version of this that was bent, and we added the surface gradients of those, then we would get this. So it's good for adding surface detail on a plane, but it's not good for wrapping things, for a big bend like that. And it can't really do transforms. I think the technical proper terms for this is that you want to put things in tangent space, which is a fancy way of saying flatten them out based on a tangent, which we'll talk about later. And then you combine things there, and then you convert them out of tangent space, which is something you do in normal and bump mapping. And we'll be talking about normal mapping and how that works in the next video. In practical terms, the regular use of surface gradients, the thing that this big research paper is about, is when you want to combine multiple normal maps or bump maps, which is not uncommon. You might have an object that has a normal map for a bunch of surface details, like, say, the wrinkles and seams on clothing, and then you want to combine it with a second normal map or a bump map that's like the fabric texture. You don't want to have to combine both, because then you need everything to be really high resolution. This comes up in game engines and optimization and stuff like that. Or you just might, for convenience reasons, want to work with multiple different maps, because you might have something specific to one object and then a texture map that's a universal decal map that's used in lots of materials. There's lots of reasons you would want to have multiple maps and not have to bake them all out. So that's what it's normally used for. But we are getting fancy here by using it in geometry nodes and to combine different components and stack detail for a custom normal system. So yeah, as I said, this is very similar, but it's not quite identical. And I don't quite understand the technical reasons, but basically the more different the two normals are, the less identical it's going to be. If you do need things to be very exact, or you need this, that's a job for normal mapping, which will be a later video. For now, we're going to look at how far we can go with surface gradients, what else we can do with them, and exactly where the limits are. But first, some people may be wondering, why do we have to do this to add normals? Why don't we just get an add node and add normals? And you will see why. This is something else entirely. It's similar, but it's not the same thing. This doesn't correspond to either of these. We know our surface gradients are doing about the right thing because it's giving something similar to our position results here. But this doesn't correspond to anything, and there's a reason why it wouldn't. So remember exactly what normals are, what is being held in a normal's vector. It's -1 to 1 for each axis. -1 being negative down the axis, and 1 being 180 degrees rotated and up the axis. So when you add these numbers, you don't necessarily get a coherent result. If you add -1y and you add +1y, the answer is 0, which is in a direction. Whereas if you were averaging those two rotations, adding those two rotations together, you'd expect it to be like 90 degrees or -90 degrees on x. Well, which one should it be? So that's kind of two problems. First, you're not getting a rotation at all. And secondly, even if you were adding them in a coherent way, should it be negative or positive? And that's the kind of problem that you run into in this sort of math, which is also why we're not really going to go into all those details. So suffice to say that when we're working with rotations, we need to work with them as rotations. If you want to combine two things, you can take a rotation and rotate it by some amount corresponding to something else. You can rotate from one thing to another, or you can add two things together in certain ways. Like what we're basically doing here is rotating from one thing to another. We get the difference between two things and the difference between two other things and combine them. So let's take this even further. I've added this other plane, which is like wrinkles but uniform. And here's the surface gradient for that added into our setup. And one of the nice things with surface gradients is if you're adding just nothing, then it does nothing. So it's easy to mix to them or multiply that 1. So it's very easy to make setups where you factor them in and out, which makes them excellent for normals keys. We talked about shape keys and position keys in geometry nodes before, and most people, I'm sure, are familiar with the idea of using shape keys for facial expressions. Well, if you want that, now with these methods, you can make normal keys that go with them. And remember, all this math is identical in both geometry nodes and the shader nodes. I'm doing it here partly to avoid compile times when I change the tree, bogging the video down, because I have so much random crap. But yeah, you could pass these attributes into the shader node, each of these sets of normals, and do it there. Or you could have these be pre-baked normal maps and use drivers, just like with an expression key system. You really have a lot of options thanks to these surface gradients, making it easy to combine multiple sets of normals. So I've been talking about how this could be applied to a character's face setup, and now let's look at a proper example of that. And keep in mind, this is only a rough example to demonstrate the principle. I'm not going to polish this up because we're not going to use this exact sort of setup in the end. So what we're looking at here is two decal patches that have been wrapped onto our face mask. We've got one for the brow, which is to define the eye ridge, and one for the cheek. And these have like a displace modifier and smoothing and stuff. So you can see that this is giving us this like dip in for the brow here. And we can control how much of that we get with these modifiers and how strong they are. Now we've got a little bit of a topology problem here. On a cleaner setup, we would resolve this hole and do this a bit differently. And then over on the cheek, it's the same idea with a displace and a smooth. So in the nodes for each of these decals, we have this get surfgrad group I've made, where what we're doing is we're getting the position wrapped and the position before the displace and smooth. And we are getting the surface gradient of the difference between the two. So this is outputting a surface gradient that corresponds to the change in normals from the pre-displace and smooth, where we've saved the position here, and after. And then on the head itself, we are bringing those surface gradients into our normals canvas. We could bring all the normals, that would be two normals for each, deformed and undeformed, and do all the math here. I just set it up this way because, if you had like a bunch of these, this is going to be more efficient. So here we've got our surface gradients coming in and then being added together and combined with the base normal. So now we can turn those on and off. There's that cheek detail. And we won't be able to see it from here too well, but if I move the light over, there's our brow ridge detail. So if I start making changes here, like turning the display solid off or the smooth, then those are reflected on here because it's being transferred over. And of course, the same thing on the cheek. And that really isn't a great shape because I haven't set the smoothing up well, but Now we can turn that way up or turn it down or whatever. And part of what we can do, which makes this so convenient, is like, we'll turn that up to a really high amount. And same for the brow. Make that double that even. That's probably way too much. But now I can kind of decide here how much of it to use. So this makes it easy to get immediate visual feedback, because a large part of the problem we have is deciding what any of this stuff should even be, which is part of the reason why this setup is only a rough example. Like, I know I might want a cheek patch so that, say, I could puff the cheeks out and have the normals correspond to that and still be clean, but I don't really know what the ideal topology for that is yet. So how do you find that out? Well, you model things and you look at them, and in order to do that, it's great to have a system where you can get immediate visual feedback. So I think if I made this cheek patch quite a bit bigger, because most of these problems like that cliff is coming because of that loop. So anyway, we'll get into that in a later video of how you actually get the right topology to get clean shapes. That's a whole puzzle in itself. But of course, rapid visual feedback isn't the only point of doing a system like this. You could, say, rig all this stuff. You could have an armature controlling this displace with a driver, or you could have it be a bone displacing it, or literally any method of rigging. It could be a shape key, any tools you want. So what this system is allowing us to do is build up and stack detail in literally any combination of tools. And again, we can do it here, or we could be doing this combined math in the shader. We could say, bake this to a normal map and have that in the shader, and then use some geometry nodes factor controlled by a bone to control the fact of its surface gradient. So this ability to combine multiple layers of normals conveniently, it really unlocks all of this as like a system and a framework, as opposed to just like an individual solution to one problem. Now, all that said, what we're looking at here right now is not the ideal form of this, which is why I'm not going to be going into detail on like what all these groups are doing. We have a lot of unnecessary steps, and that's because we have to wrap these patches onto the face mesh and then get their surface gradient, and then they have to be UV transferred, so then they're flattened, and this is flattened, and all the stuff we set up in previous videos. And all that stuff is great, but it's a lot of unnecessary steps, because when we use normal mapping instead, it's basically going to be the same concept, but the wrapping will be done with math directly. We'll be able to skip this step of mapping these onto the face mask, so it's much more efficient. So we're learning about these surface gradients working up to normal mapping, but we're not going to use it quite like this. You could, but there won't be any reason to in the end. Instead, what we'll be doing is using these surface gradients to combine the outputs of multiple normal maps. Next, let's look at some shader examples of things that work and don't. We've got two identical planes. They've got a different object index, so I can put different things in each one within the material here. And I've got some object normal maps of different shapes. I think we'll just go with the torus. So here's a bump map of some noise. And if we look at that on its own, it's a wave texture. So we've just got some ridges. And if we move the light around, it's about what you'd expect. And since this is a bump map node, it has a normal socket input. So we can plug our torus into that and see the torus with the noise bumped onto its surface, which looks pretty funky, but it is neat. So compared to no bump map, that's changing the shape quite a lot. And it's changing it in multiple directions because that, torus is a curved surface. And we can kind of see how, like, the overall shape is still kind of there. And if we turn down the influence, we'll see it even more. But it's adding those ridges into it. So here's the question. Can we do something with our surface gradients to get the same result as this, but without plugging into the incoming normal socket at the bump map node? So first, let's get the surface gradient from the original normal to just the bump map and add that back, and these should be identical, which they are. So that part's working right. And of course, if we plug the same noise into both those bump maps normals, then same result. Now, what if instead we're getting that surface gradient, and now we will add both of those together without this. And it is similar, but not quite the same. So what we're looking at here is analogous to what we saw earlier in the geometry nodes examples, where we had one version that used a displace to wrap the crumples around the surface of the bent plane, and the other version was just adding them both, the difference on the y-axis. So this is the same thing, it's about the expected result. But with this example, we can see what's going on quite clearly. When moving the light across on the z-axis, we're basically getting the same shapes, just at a different speed. You'll see the same thing here and here, almost the same thing. But we can see from the normals themselves that there's quite a bit of a difference. And if we move just on this axis, you'll really notice it. So this lower one looks like it doesn't have the bump map influence at all from this angle. And that's because it basically doesn't. Our bump map itself is only adding ridges on X and Y. There is no Z component, no vertical component to them. Whereas the torus normals do have a X, Y, and Z component because it is a curved surface. So the version with the bump map going first, it's doing the bump map on top of this normal. It's bumping on top of that curved normal. Whereas on our second example, it isn't, because it doesn't have axis. So it's a difference again between adding something on top of something else and adding two separate things together. Well, I should say adding something on the surface of something else and adding two different surfaces together. So what the surface gradient is doing mathematically, it's not wrong. It's just that these are completely different operations. So these aren't the same, and we shouldn't expect them to be. If we do want to get this to be the same, we have to have some way to wrap things onto the surface of other things. And we can do that with normal mapping. So this is a repeat of what we already saw in geometry nodes examples, but I wanted to show it here because you can really see it here. Now let's go to a different example. Down here, we have a different setup. I'm going to bring back our crumpled plane from before. So this actually has some geo to it. And over here, we have a normal map of that crumpled plane. And we also have a normal map of some leaves from my tree video. And we're going to see if we can combine the crumpled plane normals and the leaf normals on here, and if we can get it to match this. So first, let's look at the crumpled plane on its own compared to the normal map of the crumpled plane. And these are the same. This is a little different from what we saw before because this is only 2 levels of subsurf instead of 4, because I only baked the map with 2. And we can see that these do match. There's some tiny micro inconsistencies if we really look, like right there. And that's because of this being baked to pixels. So that doesn't indicate any actual problem. So there's our leaf normal map on the crumpled plane, and on the other one, the flat one, we've got the surface gradient of the difference between the plane and the leaves, and the difference between the plane and the crumpled normal map added together, and that's looking pretty good. I would say that that is working. That looks like the same thing to me. And if we go to this axis instead, it is still working. So in this case, we have successfully achieved the same shape and the same shading as this mesh plus normal map with two normal maps. And this is the proper use of surface gradients. So this also matches what we saw in our earlier GeoNodes examples. In this case, it's working because we're basically adding surface detail on an otherwise flat surface. This crumpled plane doesn't deviate a bunch. This isn't wrapped around or anything. It doesn't wrap around to like 90 degrees where it would start to break down. I'll admit I don't 100% understand exactly what in the math makes this work and the other not. But the easy way to describe it is that combining surface details works, and combining shapes that need to be layered on top of each other does not work. So just think of it that way and you'll be fine. So you could say that this is like the right use and this is the wrong use, but if this gets you where you need to go, then it's fine. Like if you're doing a geometry node setup where you're grabbing the surface gradient off of some decal meshes like I was showing earlier, and you're going to shape those decal meshes while looking at the visual result and just have the model be whatever it needs to be to look right visually, you'll end up with some weird mesh in all likelihood, but if it's working, it's working. So there's nothing wrong with that. And that's why I've gone into all of this. The proper solution to duplicate this full behavior of stacking shapes on top of each other is going to come from normal mapping, but that's a lot more complicated in some ways. So in the end, we're going to understand both, and we'll use whatever is most expedient for any given problem. And as an example of things not being perfect but getting the job done, those of you who watched my tree video may remember that we use surface gradients there. We had a normal map of the leaves, normal map to the original, but the normal map node doesn't let us use a custom normal. So instead what we did was we got the surface gradient between the original normal and the normal map, and then we combined the surface gradient onto our custom normals. And that let us get our leaf detail, even though the tree has radial normals from the center mixed with noise and all sorts of stuff. So, is there distortion from the surface gradient in this setup? How would I tell? The leaves look pretty good. I bet there is, because we understand how these things work. But, there's that leaf detail, and it's working. And we know that it works better than just mixing in the normals from that normal map without this surface gradient method. And if you want to see more about that, you can go and watch the section of the tree video. So this may not be completely realistically mathematically perfect, but it is accomplishing what I want, and it's getting me around a limitation without getting into crazy fancy custom normal mapping, which we will get into. But for now, this was quick and easy, and it achieved the visual result, and sometimes that is perfect. Alright, so I think that's enough examples for now. We've exhausted the topic. I'll put this file up, and in the next video, we'll be able to move on to tangent normal mapping, which is the big topic where we put all of these things together and resolve the rest of our issues. And then after that, we could move on to actually trying to build something that looks good, now that this series has been going for like 50 years. Anyhow, thanks for watching, and don't forget to like and subscribe. You can ask me questions. You can especially ask me questions if you support me on Patreon, and I'll see you in the next video.